Imagine building a house, but the blueprint you're using isn't for a home, it's for a prison. Well, for over 200 years, that's essentially what happened in India. A series of laws were put down, one piece at a time, not to build a nation, but to control a territory. And yet, this very framework, one forked for commerce and conquest, somehow became the unlikely foundation for one of the world's largest democracies. We are about to walk through the legal architecture of British India and uncover exactly how the machinery of an empire was repurposed to create a modern state.
You know, this story doesn't begin with the roar of cannons, but with the quiet rustle of paper. It's 1608. Merchants from the East India Company have just landed in India, and they're clutching a royal charter. Just a piece of parchment, really, from a distant king, but it gave them an absolute monopoly on trade. For a century and a half, they were just that, traders, bartering for spices and fine textiles. But then came 1765, a year that would completely pivot the destiny of the entire subcontinent.
So in 1765, after a decisive military victory, the Mughal emperor granted the company the Diwani. Now this wasn't just some business deal. This was the right to collect taxes and to run the courts for millions upon millions of people across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. I mean, in that single act, a simple trading company became a government. A corporation became a ruler. This was the true beginning of the company Raj, a strange new form of power that would eventually pave the way for the British Crown to take direct control in 1858, and then to rule right up until the final moments of independence in 1947.
Okay, let's dive into this first absolutely critical era, because back in London, Parliament was starting to wake up to a pretty startling reality. The little company they had chartered wasn't just trading anymore. It was conquering, it was ruling, it was collecting taxes from millions. It had become a corporate monster, an empire in its own right. And so the British government suddenly faced a question that had probably never been asked before in history. How in the world do you regulate a corporation that has become a state?
Their first answer was this, the Regulating Act of 1773. And this was a truly landmark piece of legislation, born out of scandal and, frankly, a lot of fear. You see, stories of these immense fortunes and just rampant corruption among company officials were flooding back to Britain. So for the very first time, Parliament stepped in. It officially recognized that the company was more than a business, it was a political power. This act was the first real attempt to impose some kind of central organized structure on the company's chaotic and, frankly, out-of-control expansion in India.
And when you look at the details here, you can see how every single clause was a deliberate move to centralize power. The governor of Bengal, with Lord Warren Hastings as the very first, was promoted to Governor General, which meant the other powerful independent presidencies of Bombay and Madras now had to answer to him. Just imagine that shift in the colonial power dynamic. A brand new Supreme Court was set up in Calcutta, imposing English law. The act also took a direct shot at corruption by banning company officials from their very profitable private trading. And finally, the leash was pulled tight. The company was now legally required to report on everything, all of its revenue, civil, and military decisions directly back to London.
But you know, the 1773 Act, it was really just a first draft, and it was deeply flawed. The core problem, the big question, it hadn't gone away. How can a government in London really control a corporation that is also an empire on the other side of the planet? The whole system was just creaking, really on the verge of collapse.
The next big answer came about 11 years later, from the Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. His solution, laid out in Pitt's India Act of 1784, was, well, it was a stroke of political genius for its time. See, instead of getting rid of the powerful company, he just decided to split its personality. He created this clever new system that would be known for decades as double government.
And this is a great way to visualize that split. On one side, you've got the company's own court of directors. They were allowed to keep managing all the commercial stuff, the ships, the cargo, the profits. But on the other side, a powerful new government body was created right in London, the Board of Control. And this board would supervise literally everything else, all political decisions, all military operations, all civil administration. So in essence, the company got to keep its business, while the British state took control of its empire.
Now this is the crucial takeaway. Words really matter. And with Pitt's India Act, the words changed profoundly. For the very first time, an act of Parliament referred to the company's lands as the British possessions in India. The pretense was over. The veil was completely lifted. This wasn't just a corporate expansion anymore. It was, officially and legally, an empire.
Let's fast forward now to the Charter Act of 1833.
This act was the final decisive step in this whole centralizing process. The title Governor-General of Bengal was totally abolished and replaced with the much grander Governor-General of India, with Lord William Bentinck being the first. Now, this was way more than a name change. It gave him absolute civil and military authority over all of British India. The lawmaking powers of Bombay and Madras, gone. Then came the final blow. The East India Company's right to trade was revoked entirely. It was now nothing more than an administrative machine governing its territories in trust for His Majesty. The corporate takeover was over. The administrative conquest was now complete.
So this intricate system of company rule, all directed from London, it held for nearly a century. But this entire structure, so carefully built up over decades, was about to be absolutely shattered by a single cataclysmic event, an explosion of violence that would change the relationship between Britain and India forever.
The year was 1857. The Sepoy Mutiny, as the British called it, erupted into a massive rebellion, what many Indians would come to call their first war of independence. The sheer scale and the ferocity of the uprising sent shockwaves all the way back to London. It was a brutal wake-up call. The system of ruling India through private company had failed, spectacularly and very, very bloodily. A radical change was no longer just an option, it was unavoidable.
The response came swiftly in 1858 with the Government of India Act. And a bit ironically, it was called an Act for the Good Government of India. Its primary function was simple and ruthless. It completely abolished the East India Company. All of its powers, all of its territories, all of its revenues were transferred directly to the British Crown. And just like that, the company's 250-year reign was over.
So here's the new chain of command. In India, the title of Governor-General was replaced by Viceroy, making it crystal clear he was the personal representative of the Queen herself. Lord Canning was the first to hold this post. And back in London, that whole complicated double government system was just scrapped. It was replaced by a single powerful new cabinet position, the Secretary of State for India, who answered directly to Parliament. The era of proxy rule was over. India was now governed directly by the British state.
You know, the trauma of 1857 taught the British a really hard lesson. Trying to rule a subcontinent without listening to its people at all was basically a recipe for disaster. So a new strategy emerged from the ashes of that rebellion, a policy of association. The idea was to seek at least some cooperation, no matter how limited, from Indians in the administration of their own country.
The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was the first, very tentative step. For the first time ever, it allowed for Indians to be associated with the lawmaking process. So in 1862, the Viceroy, Lord Canning, nominated 3 loyalist Indian aristocrats to his legislative council. Now let's be clear, they were handpicked, not elected, and they had absolutely no real power. But their mere presence in that chamber, well, that was a deeply symbolic shift. The act also reversed a long-standing trend. It began a process of decentralization by returning some legislative powers back to Bombay and Madras.
Okay, now we jump forward to 1909 and the Morley-Minto reforms. This act took a much larger and far more controversial step. It introduced the idea of separate electorates. What that meant was, for the first time, certain political seats were reserved just for Muslims, and only Muslims could vote for those candidates. Now, while the stated goal was to ensure minority representation, the act had a monumental, and many would say tragic consequence. It legally wrote religious division right into India's political DNA, setting a precedent that would echo all the way to the partition of 1947.
So as we're moving into the 20th century, the political climate in India is just heating up. Those polite requests for association have grown into powerful, organized demands for self-government. And the British find themselves on the back foot, really forced to design their most complicated systems yet, always trying to solve that same old riddle. How do you grant some responsibility without actually giving up ultimate control?
After World War I, a war in which hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers fought and died for the British Empire, the pressure for reform was just immense. The result was the Government of India Act of 1919 and its novel experiment in provincial government, diarchy. The term itself comes from the Greek for double rule, and that's exactly what it was. It was this clumsy attempt to split the government in two, giving Indian ministers control over some areas while keeping all the real power firmly in British hands.
And here's how this messy system actually worked. Provincial responsibilities were divided into 2 lists. You had the transferred list, things like education and public health, which was handed over to Indian ministers who answered to their local legislatures. But now look at the reserved list: police, finance, justice. all the real levers of state power. Those remained firmly in the hands of the British governor, who answered to absolutely no one in India. You can imagine how that played out. It was a system basically designed for paralysis, and it became a source of immense frustration for an entire generation of Indian politicians.
The last major constitutional act of the British Raj was an absolute behemoth. I mean, to give you a sense of its scale, just remember this one number, 321. The Government of India Act of 1935 contained 321 sections and 10 schedules. It was the longest, most complex, and most detailed piece of legislation that Parliament had ever passed. This was Britain's final, grand attempt to design a lasting framework for India.
And the centerpiece of this massive act was a plan for an all-India federation, which aimed to unite the provinces that were directly ruled by Britain with the hundreds of autonomous princely states. And right here, we find its most profound legacy, this division of government powers into 3 distinct lists, just like you see here, a federal list for the central government, a provincial list for the provinces, and a concurrent list for shared powers. Now, the Grand Federation itself never actually happened. The princes refused to join. But this 3-list structure, this exact architectural blueprint for sharing power, was lifted almost wholesale and placed right into the Constitution of independent India.
And so, our 200-year journey through acts and charters and commissions is finally coming to an end. The long, improvised, and often contradictory process of building a legal framework to rule India was finally over. But as this vast imperial structure was about to be dismantled, a critical question remained. What, if anything, would be left of its foundations? At the stroke of midnight on August 15, 1947, British rule in India officially came to an end. Power was transferred not to one, but to 2 new independent nations, India and Pakistan. It was a moment of profound triumph, of incredible liberation, and also of deep, devastating tragedy.
As the Union Jack was lowered for the final time and the new flags of India and Pakistan were raised, a crucial question just sort of hung in the air. After 2 centuries of constructing an administrative machine designed for one purpose, imperial control, what legacy did that machine leave behind for the new nations that were now trying to build their own futures?
Well, the answer is complex, because while independence was a total political revolution, the actual machinery of the new Indian state was, in many ways, built right on top of the old British chassis. The parliamentary system, a 2-house legislature, the structure of the civil service, the very concept of the rule of law, and especially that federal structure from the 1935 Act, all these core components were inherited from the long incremental history of British constitutional experiments.
Now, that doesn't diminish the incredible achievement or the democratic spirit of India's constitution makers at all. It just highlights a more complicated truth. They took the tools of governance they inherited, tools that were originally designed for colonial control, and they ingeniously repurposed them for a sovereign democratic republic. And it leaves us with this final profound question that every single nation has to face. How do you build a free future using the framework of an unfree past?